A lot of us take out of Africa and the origin of humans and the migration out of Africa for granted. But to a lot of medical students and physicians, it's not only not known, the implications are huge and a complete black box, and it is impacting physicians. So, humans spent the vast majority of our species' existence in Africa for the last 300,000 years. And yet, most physicians, when a patient walks into the clinic, think that their patient can be sorted into one of these racial categories. If this looks familiar, this is the wonderful U.S. Census and the various categories that somebody thought were appropriate divisions of humanity. Race, of course, as we have known in anthropology and genetics for quite some time, is a social construct. The racial categorization of two humans tells you absolutely nothing about how closely or distantly related the two individuals are. And there is no percent of recent ancestry from a particular region of the world that can determine what race somebody will be sorted into. Sadly, many physicians are tragically misinformed. Not just physicians. If you follow the literature about this over the past 20 years, it is dramatic how much progress has been made. Stanford was proudly bragging in 2005 that they had discovered that racial groupings match genetic profiles. There were quite a few red lights when this went out. The author was proud that the study showed that people's self-identified race or ethnicity is a nearly perfect indicator of their genetic background. And when they went into more detail, we find out that we're looking at this as a way of saving cost by not having to do personal genomics. Anybody who thinks that's a great idea, raise your hand, right? Nobody, right? This, of course, was completely flipped over the subsequent 20 years. And by 2025, it was broadly accepted that people's racial and ethnic identities don't reflect their genetic ancestry. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into the numerous problematic ways that they purposely set boundary conditions back in 2005 when that study was done to intentionally ignore anybody who actually had ancestry from more than one region of the world, or anybody who could be determined to be of several different regions, even within the same area. So it was deeply problematic. These beliefs are not benign. One of the things, anytime we try to get curriculum in medical education to change, we run into the objection, who cares, or why does it matter? Sure, some people believe some wrong things, but does it really change clinical outcomes? Does it impact the patient in any way? And it absolutely does. If you have not read this, the Hoffman paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on racial bias, please take a moment to read it. If you don't double take, you will double take when you read the number of different false beliefs that they have about supposed biological differences between people of different races is astonishing. They had, by the way, based on survey data, not just from first and second year med students, but re-surveying after going through med school. Resident physicians who had completed the medical curriculum were still in substantial numbers asserting that people of one race would have different nerve endings, blood coagulation, brain size, different skin thickness, and this predicts mistreatment or undertreatment of patients who need to be treated for things like painful medical conditions. What medical students should be learning is that all populations outside of Africa nest within Africa genetically. There are so many beautiful papers on this. The the one on the right, of course, I can't zoom in enough to get into all the fun. This one is wonderful because we go into a lot of the different groups in Africa, and only in the last sort of three branches of the tree do we actually see the branches that include people of European descent. So diversity in Africa, interestingly, should be pushing physicians, if anything, not in the direction of generalizing patients who fall under American racial categorization as Black or African American. It should be pushing them in the direct opposite direction. It should be driving them to demand personal level genomic data, because Africa isn't a bottleneck population. In medical school, you are frequently asked on exams and even on boards about specific high frequency gene variants that occur in populations that have undergone severe bottleneck in their ancestry. Oftentimes, these populations have also practiced some form of ethno-religious endogamy, where they marry within their group and maintain a certain degree of genetic homogeneity. This is not the case for the continent where humans originated. If you look at the haplogroup map for Africa, some of these groups have not intermarried for over 100,000 years. So a person of European ancestry and a person of East Asian ancestry are likely to be more similar genetically to each other than to a person of, say, East African and a person of West African ancestry. In the American medical system, those two patients of recent African ancestry will be treated as if they're members of the same homogeneous group. This will change how they are medicated, how their pain is treated, how they are listed for things like organ transplant. But diversity in Africa, not just at the population level, at the individual level, is dramatically higher than any other population. The frequency of private alleles is a way that we can measure this, and it's not even close to any other continent. Of course, for well over 20 years, we have known that diversity is higher within groups than between groups. This is true across various metrics by which we can measure this. There was a paper around the early 2000s that used some very statistically fishy methods to try to show that if you look for clusters where you set the n of the clusters to 5, you can roughly approximate 5 primary genetic clusters in humans that roughly approximate continents. When you look at the data in more high resolution, you find that humans actually do have around a dozen, typically we say around 14 genomic clusters if we do like a principal component analysis. But as you can tell, those are not remotely close to the racial groups that are used in American census data. They're not remotely close to the kind of racial data that is often recorded in electronic medical records in the United States. And this should shake you if you have ever seen any biomedical paper that claims to find medical differences or medication response differences between people of different races. Because if we don't have a biological basis by which to actually bin patients into those separate categories, what exactly are we measuring? It's not that there are not health disparities sometimes. Sometimes the health disparities between racial groups are very real. One of the most alarming ones right now is maternal health. For mothers who identify as Black, the rates aren't even close to those for mothers who are white. But if it's not based on biology, if there's no biological indicator that somebody should be categorized one way instead of the other, that this is a socially determined classification system, what this tells us is that race is not causal. It is a proxy variable. As long as we continue to pretend that that proxy variable is actually rooted in biology or genetics, which it is not, we will never be able to solve the racial inequity that we see in our healthcare. So what I'm proposing is that at the minimum, every medical student graduating with a medical doctorate, an MD or a DO, should know that race is a social construct, that humans share recent common ancestry from Africa and are more similar across groups than within, that all human diversity is a subset of African genetic diversity, that African diversity is still the highest. There is no biology of race. That is a myth. We are well beyond that. And we should start removing that proxy variable. There thankfully has been some movement from genetics journals and from a number of medical boards to no longer accept that as a category when turning patient data in for a paper, because it's not a biological variable. And by doing this, we can finally start to answer what is really driving inequality in healthcare between the races of our patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question and remark me up.
I'm a nephrologist by training, and we're probably the first subspecialty to actually adopt this in actual practice to remove, race variables and estimated equation for renal function. But I would argue, however, that a lot of the data that came out before the recognition that race was a social construct is not invalidated completely by the fact that now real-life race is a social construct. So I would argue that your point about it being a proxy variable is crucial, but it may be a proxy variable for other biological differences that we haven't been able to ascertain yet. They don't all have to be social constructs. That makes sense?
So we have some really interesting data on this. There's a couple different responses that often happen when we talk about race being a social construct. One of the most frequent ones that I hear is the argument that the data has to be biological. It has to be biological. When you look at the studies that are done in which patients are sorted into these categories, if it happens that you study a population, for example, at a major metropolitan hospital, there is always a chance that you are studying a small subset of a population that does have shared genetic risk factors. It's a little bit like if you said, hey, white patients in this particular region of this particular borough of New York City have a particular risk for a particular outcome. And you run the study and it really looks like that. But then when you drill down to it, it's not that they were white. It's that this happens to be a neighborhood populated entirely by Sicilian Italians who emigrated there about 150 years ago. And so these kinds of sort of micro ancestry clusters that actually do represent shared, somewhat homogeneous genetic risk can happen. The way that we show this is we actually broaden studies in different population centers, right? If you happen to accidentally find that Italians from the Sicilian region have this specific risk factor, but then you go and you study a German population and that study all of a sudden fails the reproducibility, what you're demonstrating is that it may be a regional genetic risk factor that does not extend to what we classify as the white race, because those two populations may still be clustered that way, but don't share the genetic risk factor. The problem with the way that racial data is typically registered in literature is that it continues to be treated as if it is this monolith. Black patients have this risk factor, and we don't have good data on reproducing this across populations from other areas. And when we get down to the really specific details, like if you take the enzyme activity for a particular class of enzymes, say in a liver, you can sample a population from one region of Africa and find that it functions at, say, the second percentile, and another region of Africa, and that exact same gene might function at like the 99th percentile. And so we can demonstrate again, this is not a biologically shared risk factor across the entire population that gets sorted this way.
Thank you much for bringing up this really important conversation. I was just going to get your thoughts about, as you have kind of looked at a lot of the research that have been compounding over the years, do you feel like there's more worth in the discussion about alternative proxy variables such as zip code or others over types of things that is going to categorize the different categories, or getting rid of those proxy variables as much as possible in research and moving more towards something that is focused on my personal life medicine or that kind of thing? Like when it comes to actually operationalizing this, we should steer away from utilizing race. What do you see as like the next best alternative?
Generally speaking, for those of us who are interested in the causal drivers that we want to use to change the outcomes, it's really nice whenever we can actually dig beneath the proxy variables and find out why they appear to be drivers when they're not really, right? So zip code is a great example. If we substitute one proxy variable for another, and it better approximates the causal driver, like if zip code happens to overlap with something like lead exposure in younger patients, there's a good chance that that zip code will be a good proxy variable for predicting outcomes. But what we really want to find out is if that zip code happens to be the zip code where the pipes are full of lead or the water supply is not what it should be. That should be ultimately our goal, to find that out and go ahead and solve that problem. So the goal is we move through those proxy variables, but then we get them out of the way. And part of that comes down to, if we get all of those proxy variables out for all of the causal drivers and we still have inequality in the outcome, we have to be willing to address the fact that in at least some of these cases, these are actually social determinants of health. These are actually institutionalized racist policies and inequality and opportunity and medical access and food availability that have to be fixed at a social level before they become a medical problem.
The last question. Yeah. I'm waving red the clock since the walk.
So, just kind of jumping on what you're, the cystatin, using that as the marker for, with not breaks, but, people with cystatin would do a different GFR. My concern is that that is a proxy variable for race. And I'm just, a horrible analogy with me. Imagine Victorian hell, women cannot be physicians, and so nowadays we're much more high-minded. Now we say, oh, but people who have ever had ovaries cannot be physicians. You haven't really done anything. You haven't progressed
it's still the same idea, just using a different proxy variable. My concern is that cystatin is taking the place of race. And I would feel a lot more comfortable about those kinds of things if it was race agnostic. Have we done anything about that?
So there are a number of clinics now that will do a pharmacogenomic screen before prescribing a medication. And it's really a great step in the right direction because instead of saying, you know what, I don't think this first line therapy is going to work for you because in the past, people with your racial identity didn't do so well on it. Instead of doing that, we just bypass any generalizations at all. We recognize the complexity in populations and we do a pharmacogenomic screen on each individual patient. And if their particular enzyme panel comes back showing that they will either hypermetabolize or hypometabolize a particular therapy, we know whether initiation of that therapy is appropriate or whether we actually have a causal reason to move to a different therapy. And that kind of personalization is what we owe to every patient of every ancestry.
Thank you so much. I would like to close this session. Thank you very much for participating and have a good lunch. See you. Thank you so much for listening and also for food.